we think about international sanctions against corporations or countries or individuals, we usually think about them as being in response to really severe wrongs, international human rights violations, corruption, terrorism, something like that. Lately, however, that assumption doesn't hold. The Trump administration is starting to use sanctions as a routine instrument of foreign policy against people, countries, institutions that it doesn't like. For example, earlier this year, President Trump ordered sanctions against the International Criminal Court and its Chief Prosecutor, Karim Khan, because it didn't like some of the investigations that court was pursuing. It has also issued sanctions against a particular UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, who listeners may remember has been on this podcast. And some experts are calling this an attack on the rule of law, and it's really genuinely created some deep uncertainty, particularly among those who are working in the UN system or working on human rights issues.
You and I have spent, 3 or 4 years now sort of reflecting on the barriers and the difficulties that the human rights system is facing. So today we're going to talk about the implications of these sanctions. And as our listeners know, and you know, I'm actually on these mandates. So I'm going to talk today about how it's impacting me personally. And apropos of what I just said, I am going to make clear that everything that I say today is said in my personal capacity as a law professor at Yale and not as a mandate holder. And it doesn't indicate support of any particular mandate or mandate holder. But these sanctions, as I think is clear by what I just said, has some pretty severe implications and a chilling effect on the independence of mandate holders and their ability to do their work.
So today we're going to explore that question in further depth. What happens when sanctions reach into the United Nations, target human rights defenders themselves? And what does that mean for the future of the system we've been wrestling with these many episodes?
Yeah, so let's do it. That's what we're doing this podcast for. So let's do it.
So, Claudia, we are recording this shortly after the opening of the UN General Assembly. Donald Trump gave a very aggressive speech telling countries that they were going to hell and there's so much potential that they could exercise. The UN's obviously in crisis, and you're in it somewhat. So I want to ask you a little bit about what is going on there and what it's like to be a member of a human rights working group right now at the United Nations.
Yeah, so, it's, I would say it's like, I'm in a particular mood today because, as you mentioned, Donald Trump spoke yesterday, and I actually ended up having to stand outside the night before for 45 minutes on the street waiting for his motorcade to go by while I was trying to get to a dinner with Hillary Clinton. So, but, I will say that I thought that Monday was an interesting little capsule of where the UN is at. There's a new president of the General Assembly. She's German. Her name is Annalena Baerbock. And people are really excited about her. In her opening speech, she talked about the fact that there had never been a female secretary general. So I think that's like something that's on people's minds. So I say that to sort of indicate that I think there is some energy and some effort to maybe make some of the reforms that have been long overdue within the UN and try to figure out ways to increase its dynamism in a moment where it's really, really needed. But on the other hand, there was also a lot of doom and gloom to the opening speeches. The first day, there was just a lot of language about the sort of imminent doom that the world is facing if we don't pull it together and really commit to this international system, which, as you and I know, having dedicated our lives to it, was brought on in a moment where humanity was doing really badly and really terrible things, and was an effort to instill some structure and common commitments. And so then this was followed with Donald Trump making a speech the next day, which by all accounts was just really disrespectful, filled with mischaracterizations, and an effort to really demonstrate disdain for the United Nations. And that was really, really hard to watch, having been there on the first day, where despite everyone's differences and despite the pettiness of diplomacy, which is inevitably there was a real sense of effort to try to continue this common project.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I wonder if I can pick up on something you said. It was a moment of deep gloom when the thing was invented. It was an imperfect instrument. And there have been a lot of critiques of it over the years, including, for example, the human rights system and the recreation of the Human Rights Council, which really hasn't worked out that well. You mentioned reform. So, from your point of view, what are the overdue reforms that the new Secretary General could, excuse me, the new President of the General Assembly could try to implement?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think whatever reforms are needed outside the human rights system is beyond my pay grade, and I think there's a lot. But I think within the human rights system, there's a number of things that are like nearing catastrophic right now, and I think that'll be also a good segue into talking about some of the complications that are impacting me. But as you know, a lot of the work on human rights is done within the Human Rights Council, and this is like a subset of states that are rotating, and they focus on human rights issues, and they're based in Geneva. And then there's the special expert mechanism, of which I'm a part, the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, that has 60 to 70 mandate holders that focus on different issues, and they do country visits and engage with states. So this mechanism has been quite successful, actually. And then, of course, there are the treaty bodies that are charged with enforcing the various human rights treaties and monitoring compliance. These systems are quite built up, but what's happening now is, first of all, they are being starved for funding. I was actually sitting next to the chair of the CEDAW committee that is charged with enforcing and monitoring compliance with CEDAW, which is the Women's Human Rights Treaty. And they've had a lot of their funding cut. They can't meet as often as they used to. It's a huge number of experts that all need to be on the same page in order to issue anything that interprets CEDAW, general comments, or monitor particular states. And I think she actually told me that she was starting to pay for her own plane tickets for things because, she was committed to the work, and the funding just wasn't there, and they were being told that they couldn't do certain things. On the special expert side, the expert mechanisms have traditionally done 2 country visits a year, which is not a lot. It's 2 deep dives into country situations, and they can be quite impactful because you meet with, all of the ministries and civil society, and you visit prisons, and you really get to know the human rights situation of a country and issue a report and recommendations. And for many of the mandates, country visits have now been reduced to one country visit a year. The mechanisms are not able to travel to Geneva and engage with the Human Rights Council. All of these things, they're important because everything is being done remotely, and everything requires some level of collaboration and cooperation. And so the funding just isn't there. Reports are being reduced by word count,
Hmm.
which, maybe some people will be happy about, and maybe it's a good thing, but when you're trying to, basically include, the entire, like all of the human rights, problems in a prison system, for example, or, it's hard to do that in a small amount of words. So, or things are not being translated, and so then fewer people have access to it. So these things that are sort of boring administrative elements actually end up mattering a lot. Another example, the special experts, as you know, are volunteers, right? My full-time job is to teach at Yale, but I also do this. We receive some support from the OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and so every mandate holder has like 1 or 2 or 3 people within OHCHR that actually kind of run everything. Those offices are now being dramatically reduced, or offices are being shared. So, for example, we have someone that supports the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. Now we're sharing some of those people with the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, for example, which is interesting because we have very different perspectives from the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and we have the same technical support, which is also, just sort of an interesting development. But yeah, these kinds of things are making it really hard to function in a system that honestly was already very carefully balanced.
Can I just ask you about that? I mean, you might say, well, if you're sharing staff, that's efficient. And by the way, I'm kind of also interested as a side point about the differences in perspective between the Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and the working group.
Yeah.
Maybe I could just ask you about that first, and then we'll go into the structural things.
Yeah, so I think it's pretty well documented that the working group, some of the issues that it's been very supportive of are reproductive rights issues, support to LGBTQ plus rights, surrogacy. We've done a report on the rights of sex workers. And the current Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women has actually just taken a different perspective on trans women in sports, which is what you and I talked about last time. She's
Mhm.
not in support of this. She's been really focused on sex being the basis for international human rights, whereas the working group and, in my opinion, the standard and the norms of the international human rights system have acknowledged, and importantly, that gender, sort of the roles and the stereotypes that societies and cultures actually assign to sex, are really the basis for discrimination. And that's where we need to do the work as societies.
Yeah.
And the Special Rapporteur has been much more focused on sex just as the biological trait, and discrimination being based on one's sexual identity. So I think
That's so interesting. Yeah.
yeah,
That's so interesting. I mean, it suggests to me that, the UN, of course, is, and your work is sort of sounds in technical expertise. We're the human rights experts. We're going to advance human rights through application of this knowledge. But of course, there is a political, small p political element to it.
sure.
And countries are represented in this system. So that, in a sense, that's the paradox of the UN writ large, right? That you have efforts to solve global problems, which requires technical expertise, but countries differ in their perspective, and sometimes that's going to interfere with the flow of the work.
I think that's right. We are not supposed to represent countries. We are supposed to be independent experts based on our own expertise. But you're still going to get differences of opinion. And the truth is, I think that's very healthy. I think that sometimes, it's interesting if you watch, for example, the first Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Radhika Kumaraswamy, is actually here at Yale for the semester. And I had coffee with her the other day. And just thinking about her work and how the mandate has evolved with different experts, you really do see different perspectives. And I think that's the global conversation that we're all involved in which we work these things out. That's how you do constitutional interpretation. That's how you do treaty interpretation. You try to stick to the text, but in the end, all of this is about some level of global consensus and how the world is understanding what these rights mean. And, if you listen to our speeches, so both I and the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women spoke at the opening of the 30th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women on the first day that the General Assembly met. If you listen to my speech, I say very explicitly that right now there is a backlash on gender equality and the very concept of gender, which is true. This concept of gender is receiving a lot of resistance in diplomatic spaces, in part because there are very huge differences of opinion on the rights of LGBTQ plus community members. And there's also, I think, just a backlash on some of the more traditional women's rights that you and I would have taken for granted. And the preservation, in my opinion, of understanding that these are societal creations is incredibly important. But then if you listen to the speech of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, she spent some time talking about how sex is the word that's used in treaties, right? And there's an evolved understanding. There's a lot of support for our understanding of gender. But in any case, these are differences of opinion, and so you will hear sort of the different perspectives. And I think these conversations being live, essentially.
So we've been talking about, I mean, this is sort of the starvation of resources, which is caused by what exactly? The U.S. stopping its contributions, or has there just been an
I won't even, I mean, I'll blame the US for a lot of other things, and I think I will shortly. But honestly, this isn't just the United States. A lot of European countries have also withdrawn support. What I've heard is the rationale, and here we can go back to the US, is that a lot of states are actually reinvesting in defense. And so they're pulling resources from human rights and other initiatives. But we really can't underestimate what a huge change this is. As you and I know, for example, the Inter-American system, which has been really successful, the regional system of the Organization of American States, the Inter-American Court and the Inter-American Commission, for a while now has not been receiving enough funding from the Americas to function. And so actually Northern European states have been contributing to the functioning of the Inter-American Court and the Inter-American Commission just in an effort to support the regional human rights systems. So if those states start pulling funding away from the human rights system, it's going to affect the human rights system both at a regional and international level. And that is for sure happening. And then you have the foundations that are also under attack a lot from U.S. policy. So they're also pulling funding away from some of the UN agencies. I'll give you an example, and this is the U.S. I was just in Zimbabwe Zimbabwe has maybe 14, I think it's 14 to 16 domestic violence shelters. Um, all of them run by civil society organizations in partnership with the government. One NGO was running, I think, 8 of them and lost like $1.5 million from U.S. funding, and is basically having to like either shut them down or figure something out. So this is very tangible impact on people's lives and safety. And you can think whatever you think about who was responsible for that in the first place, but people are getting harmed.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The Europeans also support the African human rights system writ large. And I worry in my work on democracy around the world, part of the pitch that we make is that you need democracy, you need human rights, and the political pitch is migration. It's related to migration. If these countries are dysfunctional, you're going to have waves and waves of people, and that's the political thing that, gets support. I really worry with the rightward turn of those governments, with the way that there's a tendency to just mimic the policies of the US. If Trump is really successful, you're going to get little Trumplets all over the place, and they will mimic that hostility, if you will, to human rights and international cooperation. So that doesn't bode very well. I want to turn to another issue, which is the issue of sanctions. And I wonder if you could just talk about, so we hear about sanctions against certain UN personnel. What does that look like from the inside? And maybe you could describe those.
Yeah, so I mean, sanctions are turning out to be kind of a favorite tool of this administration in trying to control what happens at the international level. And I think you're aware that Francesca Albanese, who we had on this podcast several episodes ago, she's the special expert on the occupied Palestinian territories. So she's the mandate holder that focuses on Palestine. She has been sanctioned by the U.S. government because of her support to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And what this means is that her assets have been frozen in the U.S. She's Italian, and she had some assets or bank accounts, I'm not sure, but some assets in the United States. And so her assets have been frozen, and the sanctions actually subject you to the potential of a 20-year criminal penalty also. So this is serious stuff, and so, there's what do we want to say, radiating effects from all of this. So that in and of itself is quite awful. I mean, her job is to speak out and monitor the human rights violations that are occurring in Palestine, and whatever country is responsible for them, and that's what she's doing. And she's part of the UN expert mechanism. So she's been sanctioned, which means that any legal permanent resident or US citizen of the United States that engages with her in the sense that supports her work or receives support from her can also be subject to sanctions. Now, it's really important to think about just how broad this definition is, and I've spoken to a lot of people at this point about what this actually includes. But essentially, any kind, if you sort of verbally support her work, if you support it in writing, or if you receive support from her, you are violating the sanctions order. Now, within the special expert mechanisms, there's a huge amount of collaboration, right? It's nearly 70 different expert mechanisms. We do some things on our own, and we do some things in collaboration. For example, the working group visited Afghanistan with the expert on Afghanistan several years ago to really draw attention to the treatment of women. So that was a collaboration because there were overlapping mandates, and there are so many mandates that there's quite a bit of overlap. But one of the ways in which that experts are constantly collaborating is through issuing either press releases or in their communications with governments. And it's an efficiency of the system. If, for example, there's a state that is violating the rights of women in prison, it would make sense for the special experts who focus on women's rights and the special experts who focus on detention, arbitrary detention, torture, other human rights to actually do things together. So rather than send one communication from each mandate that then the state has to use its resources to respond to, the mandates collaborate. So what these sanctions mean is potentially that any mandate holder that either signs on to a statement that Francesca Albanese is inviting other mandate holders to sign on to, or has Francesca Albanese sign on to something that they've done, they could be in violation of the sanctions. And this is really a huge operational problem, as you can imagine. So you set that against, the possibility that you could be exposing yourself both to civil liability and to criminal prosecution, and the fact that these entire mandates just rely on experts being able to function in an independent manner and state their opinion and advocate in the way that they think they should be advocating, there's a problem here. Now, there is an overlay, which is that supposedly the experts have privileges, UN privileges and immunities. And maybe you can explain a little bit more what that means. But it's unclear whether or not the current US administration would respect those privileges. And it's unclear in a political sense whether or not the United Nations would have the leverage and the ability to actually protect the mandate holders. And so far, they haven't been able to do it for Francesca. And she is currently operating. She's doing volunteer work under this sanctions order.
Wow, that's intense. Yes, of course, privileges and immunities are originate with diplomats, right? If I'm a diplomat in another country, I can't be arrested. I get to have security of my residence and things like this. And by extension, we have a kind of privileges and immunities for representatives of international organizations, but they're functional. They're sort of a little more limited than the traditional ones for diplomats. But it would mean, for example, that Francesca, in normal circumstances, has the privilege of being able to come attend the UN meeting in New York, regardless of other visa status and things like that. And that's what's been removed and such. And so that's itself a kind of escalation that the U.S. is now politicizing who can come to the UN meetings. They
Yeah.
denied the representatives of Palestine to be able to come. So it's the politicization of everything. But I'm really interested in this micro, you know, illustration of it in some sense that you yourself have to be careful talking to this person who, again, we had on our show, and we're not taking that episode down. I mean, that was that, and maybe that was material support or something like that. But this the escalation of everything that we're seeing is obviously something that at some point just has to be resisted. But how and when you do that and who does that is really hard. So, practically speaking, how are you guys grappling with this? Are you, you have conversations in which she's not in the room, or you have, how does that actually work to get the work done?
I mean, the sanctions order is new. And actually, I think if I'm remembering this right, there's sort of a grace period until October 4th. So there hasn't been, so the rubber hasn't hit the road just yet. But I honestly don't know. I mean, that's the reason we're talking about it here. I don't think there's an easy solution. And I think the important thing here is that it's not just, she was saying, so this particular mandate was sanctioned, and that in and of itself is hugely problematic. But the impact on the entire system is huge.
Hmm.
And it's chilling. It's chilling in many, many ways. And it's hard not to see this as just these strategic efforts to undermine the international human rights system overall, which again, for all of the critique, I think that the US kind of scholars and activists love to lob at the UN. I mean, this was a miracle, like a human rights system full of experts that were all volunteering their time. And it's a huge job, I mean, there are people who are doing this full time and have, Graham Reed, who is the special expert on gender identity and sexual orientation. We're doing a live recording with him and Emily Bazelon in November of the podcast. He was the head of Human Rights Watch, of the LGBTQ plus department of Human Rights Watch, and he actually left his job so he could do this full time. So there are people that do that and are able to do that, and then there are people like me who are trying to balance it with the work they normally do, because I'm able to incorporate some of that work. But it was already a miracle that this was happening. It was already one that was relying on, shoestrings here and there. And now the U.S. has come in and, really spectacularly just upended it. And it's for someone who, believes that this is necessary, it's really devastating to watch. And frankly, it's really devastating for me to even have to be thinking about these things and what I can say and who I can talk to and who I can collaborate with within the system, both wanting to support the system, but at the same time, not wanting to be reckless. And you and I know, like, there's more and more of these decisions that we're having to make. We've been interviewing individuals who have been activists within authoritarian countries, and it's all very familiar.
Yeah, there's really no difference than, say, what we saw in Turkey over the last few years, or you know, Hungary isn't even this repressive. And and obviously the free speech stuff dimensions here in the United States is a conversation on its own. But I guess I wanted to ask you, push back a little bit in the sense that the whole UN is a remarkable achievement and it's imperfect and we criticize it. But at the end of the day, it's there and it's going to be there. And if the United States wants to leave it, it will reestablish itself in Geneva or Bangkok or many of the other centers. And there's not really a substitute for the legitimacy that it gives when you say you're a special rapporteur or you're a member of the UN working group. I mean, the only way that those things were working to begin with was through voice and through the legitimacy that came from that. So, doesn't that seem like an asset that can't be taken away no matter how hard they try?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that something will exist. And if the US ends up wanting to isolate itself, then I guess that's what the United States is going to do. I think there's a separate issue of what will happen to those of us who are operating in this environment, and what choices we're going to have to make. But in terms of the world itself, yes, I mean, I think that there is something potentially liberating here about the US just being kind of straightforward about its disdain, that I kind of see actually banding people together. And some of the language actually that I heard a lot in the speeches on the first day was, we all have grievances, but now it's really time to put them aside, and that can be frustrating, as an outsider watching the diplomatic dynamics. But I do think that, we'll see, but I think there is an energy to try to save what exists, of the states that are supportive. I worry about like resources and stability, because like I said, if states feel like they're in danger, they need to put all the resources towards defense, and then you start setting priorities, and the human rights system won't feel like a priority until it absolutely is.
Yeah, I mean, of course, one substitute for funding for the UN has been China in recent years. Does that ever touch the human rights system? Have you seen China come in and sort of substitute for the US human rights with Chinese characteristics?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what substituting for the US looks like, but a number of mandates, including the working group, receive funding from China. And actually, in this opening session of the anniversary of the fourth conference on women, the fourth World Conference on Women, there was a representative. I believe she was the deputy head of the National Working Committee on Children and Women in the State Council of China. So there was a speaker from China, and I know that women's rights, for example, is part of China's foreign policy, along with, Spain also has a priority in their foreign policy on gender equality. So I think that, we'll see. I was sitting next to, as I mentioned, the chair of the CEDAW committee, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and also the head of UN Women. All of them are originally from general Middle Eastern, the region, which I thought was really interesting, and really good, I think, because, one of the criticisms of the human rights system has always been that it's like this Western, maybe Latin American concoction. But the truth is that a lot of elements of the human rights system are actually like becoming very internationalized, and there are other regions where leaders that have already existed in those regions, obviously, are really being put in these leadership positions. And so it's generating rich conversation, that we all need to have. So I see that as a good thing. It's about whether or not the center can hold, in this time when it's really being pressed in by a huge world power.
Wow. Well, that's really super interesting, and keep up the good work. Fight the good fight.